Thank you, Linda, for that lovely music to open our session today. I wanted to welcome everyone, whether you're a friend of Mary Magdalene Apostle Catholic Community here in San Diego, or a member of Contemplative Outreach in San Diego or North San Diego, or one of our extended friends and family from anywhere. And we are glad that you are joining us today. Today, we'll be presenting our morning of study and prayer on Thérèse of Lisieux by the amazing and wonderful Oliva Espín. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Oliva.
Hello, everybody. Glad to have you all here. And let's start with what you are seeing right now, which is actually a real picture of Thérèse. And this is a picture that is actually also in a big frame in the Carmel of Lisieux, in the chapel of the Carmelites there. But it's in many other places, and it's probably of her photographs the one that is most moving, because it seems as if she's asking us, okay, so what are you gonna do? And that's why I particularly like this photograph of her. Okay, so let me tell you briefly what we are going to be doing today. We are going to be talking about Thérèse, about her life, the cultural context of her life, and in that, or from that perspective, try to understand better what she said, how she said it, why she said it, etc. So we're going to have a break in between for a few minutes, and Linda will give us some of her beautiful music again during that time. And then at the end, I'm going to leave some time for questions and answers. And you will all have access at the end to a video, and you will also have access to a bibliography of works about Thérèse that I'm going to sort of be talking about as we progress. Okay, this is what we are used to seeing about Thérèse. The photograph on the right was a transparency I had when I was teaching using transparencies, and it became very bad, but it's one of the typical representations of her. And the one on the left is a typical holy card of her. So it's sort of a dulcify expression of this person whose face did not really look like this. So Thérèse is known for her little way, for the importance of doing everyday little things with love. But initially, she was really known as a miracle worker saint. She became popular with people writing things back to the Carmel of Lisieux, telling them she has done this, she has done that for me. And they published a yearly book called The Shower of Roses, because she had promised to shower roses on earth from heaven. So the book is entitled, the books they published every so often, Shower of Roses. And the fact is that she has more statues, more candles around her statues, and more sanctuaries anywhere in the world, in any church in the world. The only one who has more than her is Saint Francis. So she's the most popular saint of the Catholic Church, certainly the most popular woman saint in the Catholic Church. And there are sanctuaries in her honor, even in Cairo and in a bunch of other places, and not among Christians. Apparently, she had a big following. I don't know if that's still there, but at some point among Muslim women in Egypt. So it's an interesting thing to know about her. So we are going to be looking basically at the things she wrote And they're old and new versions of the story of the soul. But before we really start getting the value and the importance of what she said, we sort of need to bypass her language. She writes like a late 19th century provincial woman who did not have much education. She had only like a 5th grade education. And so a lot of her words end up with exclamation points, and there's French expressions that she uses constantly. The word little, petit, is used constantly in her writing and in reference to her. And there's a French expression that is ce pauvre petit, this poor little whoever. And you're talking about your father, or you're talking about a friend, or you're talking about anybody, and they're all poor little something. God is never God, is always good God. And sometimes Jesus is even the poor little something. So we need to know that this mushy language is there, and sort of try to ignore, because the mushy language gets irritating for us in more than a century after her. Two important characters in terms of the creation of the story of a soul and the canonization of Thérèse, and her sister Pauline, who was the prioress for a while. Her religious name was Agnes of Jesus, and Mother Marie de Gonzague, who was the prioress for most of the time that Thérèse was in the convent. And in fact, Thérèse wrote to her even before she entered Carmel. And there was a big competition and jealousy between Pauline, Mother Agnes, and Mother Marie de Gonzague. And the story of a soul sort of was caught in that. Thérèse also wrote theater plays, particularly theater plays about Joan of Arc. She had a big devotion to Joan of Arc, who had not been canonized yet. She wrote poems that are rather mediocre. They have beautiful sentiments, but the poems as poetry are mediocre. Remember, those of you who were for the John of the Cross seminar that I did some months ago, John's poetry is magnificent. Thérèse's poetry is mediocre. But, it has nice sentiments and expresses sort of her theology, etc. She has thousands of letters. There's a thick volume of her letters that has been published. Many of the letters were to two priests that she was in charge of praying for and contacting and encouraging them, two very young priests. And some of the letters were to her family, particularly and especially to her sister Celine, who was the person who was her most loved companion. And then there's another book entitled Last Conversations that was published by, again, the Carmel of Lisieux, that contain words that Pauline said, Thérèse had said to her. And there's a controversy around these last conversations, because some of the key phrases that we have associated with Thérèse, like I'm going to rain roses on earth after I die, and several other things like that, come from the last conversations. But there's no way of knowing if that's what Thérèse really said. And although they fit the sentiment of Thérèse, so maybe they are possibly, most probably they're true, there's still some authors sort of have, discussions about this, because Pauline wrote these things in little pieces of paper that then she transcribed to several notebooks that were black, and then she decided to make them better, edited them for better French into green notebooks, and finally she put it all in a yellow notebook that it's the one that was published. And of course, what happened along the way when all that was happening. There are authors who think that that makes them completely legitimate. There are authors who think that there are things there that are of value. And we know, in reality, that Pauline actually altered what Thérèse had written. And the first manuscript of the story of the soul is created by Pauline. And she, or Mother Agnes, she altered the order of Thérèse's manuscripts, added some poems at the end, and people who are obsessive about these things and look in detail about it, there are about 7,000 corrections that Pauline did, or that some people did, because there was a priest who also put his hand in it, and Mother Marie de Gonzague also distorted some things, etc. So the final manuscripts, the original, I should say, manuscripts of Thérèse were published in 1956. And this, Pauline died in 1951. She had fiercely guarded whatever Thérèse wrote and did not want anyone to see it. After she died, the Carmel of Lisieux was ordered by the Vatican to let people go in and look at the real manuscripts. And what we read now, when we read modern versions of the story of the soul, is translations of those manuscripts. Okay, now there are many, 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 many books about Thérèse. There are lots of books about Thérèse. Many of those are pious books. But there are several Frenchmen who have done very serious studies of Thérèse that are not pious books. They're reverent, they're careful, but they are historical studies. One is Jean-François Six, who was a priest and who completely disliked Pauline and her distortions. And he's one of the ones who believe that the last conversations are completely illegitimate. Then there's Claude Langlois, who has about 4 or 5 books about Thérèse, particularly one about the desire of priesthood of Thérèse. And I will refer to that later, because he's a layman who was the director of studies of religion. I don't remember the exact title, at the Sorbonne. So he was very serious about studying Thérèse. And he became interested in looking at Thérèse because he has an important book about the role of convents in 19th century France that gave women opportunities that they couldn't find anywhere else. And from there, he went to Thérèse, and he did wonderful work. I mean, his books are really impressive. Unfortunately, they're not translated into English. I've put them on the list, that on the resources that you will receive later. Because some of you might read French, but unfortunately, they're not translated into English. There's a very good study by Maître about her psychological development that, again, I'm going to refer to, but that is not translated either. And then in English by Americans, we have a book by Thomas Nevin that is very, very good. And also, you may not know, but Dorothy Day wrote a biography of Thérèse. And one of the interesting things, or 2 interesting things, is she named her daughter for Thérèse. And initially, she intended to name it for Teresa of Avila, but when she was in the maternity ward, another woman said, oh, but Thérèse de Lisieux is more interesting. And she sort of changed that. She became interested in Thérèse. And of course, each one of these authors has their own perspective. One interesting thing about Dorothy Day's book on Thérèse is that there's a chapter entitled Mental Illness. And I'm going to talk about Therese's mental health as we go along. Okay, so here we have it. So this on the left is the first, 1898, a year after Thérèse died, History of a Soul, published in by the Polish press of the time, and it includes her writings, letters, poems, a few photographs, etc. But things that Pauline put in there, as I said, in her own particular distortion. And the book on the right is, the cover is from a film entitled Thérèse, that came out maybe 2 decades ago, maybe even more than that, the film. But in any case, the original manuscripts were published in facsimile form, Thérèse's handwriting, and then that was published in 1956, and then it was published in regular print, not her handwriting, not a transcription of just her work. I mean, her handwriting in 1957, and the content of this manuscript, there have been many versions of it and sort of different kinds of publications since then, but the first time they appeared in print form was in 1957. And what we find is when Thérèse underlines something 3-4 times, they render it in capital letters. When she underlined only once, they render it on italics. And it's also italics when she's citing something. Okay, let's go. So what composes the story of a soul is 3 manuscripts. There's manuscript A about her childhood that was written for Mère Agnes, for Pauline, in a notebook. She was telling stories about her childhood during recreation time. Pauline was then the mother prioress, so Pauline ordered Thérèse to write those memories of childhood. And in beginning to write that, Thérèse says, I am not a grand flower, I'm just a little flower, in her preference for the word little. So, so that's why in English, she started being called Little Flower, because it's easier for English-speaking people to say Little Flower than to say Thérèse of Lisieux. When I was studying French to pronounce this sound, we were told, you put your mouth as if you were going to say ou, and you say eh, and what comes out is Lisieux. Okay, neither here nor there. But because it's a complicated sound, English-speaking people prefer to say Little Flower, which I don't think serves the purpose of understanding Thérèse as a mature woman. It makes her look like a little something, like someone who's not, it dosifies her, which is part of what creates problems to really find what she's trying to say. Manuscript B is a letter to her sister Marie, who was also a nun, in the convent. It's a 10-page manuscript. It's a letter to her sister Marie, but it's addressed to Jesus. She tells at the beginning of the letter to Marie, you're asking me to tell you about these things, but it's easier for me to tell you these things if I'm talking to Jesus, so I'm going to address the letter to Jesus. Okay. And then manuscript C was written to Mother Marie de Gonzague, who at that time was, again, the prioress of the convent, and Thérèse was now clearly dying. So Pauline went to Mother Marie de Gonzague and said, I have this manuscript here, you have it, that is about her childhood that she wrote for me because I asked for it. But it would be a pity if we don't have things about her life in Carmel. So why don't you ask her to write about that? So Mother Marie de Gonzague asked Thérèse to write, and she wrote in this small notebook in pencil. It's a very small notebook. And she stopped writing in June 1897, 3 months before she died, because she couldn't write anymore. And that is a very important document in terms of who she was and how she saw things. So these 3 manuscripts are what we get now when we read the story of a soul. And now it's impossible to find the 1898 and the versions of the story of a soul that were published in many different languages through half a century, until the 56, 57 publication of the manuscripts. But now it's impossible to find it, and it's good. I mean, this is the real writing that Thérèse does. This is in her handwriting. Okay. Let's talk a little about her family here. Her family, her parents both wanted to enter convents and couldn't. They got married. They weren't sure that they should have sex. And in fact, her mother has a very strange description of her own life. She says her whole life was like a shroud. And she never cried more intensely than on her wedding night, because how horrible, and etc. But in any case, they had 9 children. And 4 of those children died in infancy, 2 boys and 2 girls. Actually, one of the girls was died when she was about 5 years old from leukemia. So that was not just in infancy. Marie was the oldest, Pauline, Leonie was the middle one, Celine was Thérèse's companion all her life, and then of course Thérèse, who was the very youngest one. The historical context of the time in France was a big fight between monarchic versus republican, which meant Catholic versus anti-clerical. And republican has nothing to do with the Republican Party here. It was people who wanted the republic versus the monarchy. And it was not just that they disagreed politically, it's that they were at each other's throats, because each one of them believed, and to some extent it was true, that the other group wanted to destroy them. So therefore they had to turn back and destroy them. She was born 3 years after France was defeated in 1870-71 by the Prussians. Napoleon III had to leave. I mean, it was a big defeat for France. And after that time, France has been a republic. So it was a very serious fight about who France would be. And she, of course, was on the side of the conservative, Catholic, monarchy, etc. The cult of Joan of Arc actually was caught in this kind of comings and goings. These are her parents. Her father was a jeweler and watch repairman. His business was okay, but her mother made lace, something called point d'alençon, which was a very complicated and difficult form of lace that was very appreciated by wealthy people, and paid, I mean, just a little bit, 2 inches of point d'alençon today costs more than $100. It was equally expensive then. So her mother made a lot of money, to the point that the father decided he was selling his own business and becoming an administrator of his wife's business. The other thing important about Zélie is that she discovered a lump in her breast in 1865. So when her babies were born, the latest children, the ones closer to Thérèse, she was developing breast cancer, so she could not breastfeed them. And that was true in relation to Thérèse also, and we'll get to that in a moment. By the time she decided to go to the doctor, because you don't show your breast to anybody, right? It was too late to do anything for her. They even went to Lourdes to see if she would be healed by a miracle, and etc. But so she died of breast cancer. So when Thérèse was born, the breast cancer was fairly advanced. And in fact, for the last year of her life, Celie could not sleep and spend the night screaming with pain because they were not using painkillers. The only painkiller was morphine, and that they did not want to use that. And in fact, when Thérèse was dying herself, they did not use morphine for her. So she also was in terrible pain. So this little girl is hearing upstairs her mother yelling and screaming in desperate pain every night. Celie died when Thérèse was 4 years old. Okay. So maternal losses were sort of the most important experience for Thérèse as a child. So her mother is dying of breast cancer. And when she was 2-3 months old, the mother could not feed her. She was poisoning her with breast milk. So she was sent to a woman in the country called Rose Taillet, who was very lively, young, sort of the opposite of Celie, which was always depressed and always anxious and always preoccupied with death. Even though her letters are full of things about death, regardless of her own one. So Thérèse spent a year with Rose Taillet, and she loved Rose. And every time Rose brought her into town to see her mother and other people at home, she cried desperately until she was back in Rose's arms. And then when she was sent home, and now she was living with her family, with her mother, who was, as I said, screaming in pain during the night, every time Thérèse saw Rose in town, she started crying. So she always missed Rose. And actually, one of the authors, Jacques Maitre, said that her preoccupation with flowers and roses and sending Rose to earth and all that is an unconscious metaphor for this woman who had made her so happy and felt so loved during that first year of her life. And of course, proportionately, whatever we do in a year of life for a 1 year old is all of life. So that's important. Pauline then became her mother. When her mother died, Celine said, "Oh, Marie, now you're my mother." And Thérèse said, "Well, my mother will be Pauline." And Pauline, in fact, was very motherly with her, and they loved each other and played and studied and etc. And then one day, Thérèse overheard Pauline telling Marie that she was going into the convent. And it devastated her completely. And after that, she started having some reactions that we'll get to in a minute. And then shortly after that, Marie went into the convent also in Carmel. So they were living in the town of Alençon. And they were all born in the town of Alençon. Okay. So after the mother's death, they moved to Lisieux for the first time. Uncle Isidore, mother's brother, lived in Lisieux. And the mother was not too confident that Louis, the father, would be good enough to raise their children and wanted them to be near her mother. And so, her brother, wanted the children to be near her brother to take care of them. So they moved to Lisieux. And that's where she really grew up, from 4 to whenever she died. Around the time, or immediately after the time, when Pauline entered the convent, Thérèse started having an illness. She had had migraine headaches for months after Pauline went into the convent. And then her uncle Isidore talked to her about her mother. And she started having, she started trembling and screaming and crying and having convulsions and having a very, very strong reaction. When she wrote about this illness, she says that it was the devil who was doing this to her because he was jealous that Pauline had gone into Carmel and that her family were gonna be becoming all nuns because all her sisters, not just her, all her sisters became nuns, and that the devil was jealous. So she spiritualizes a lot when she doesn't know what to do with things, which is in a way typical of the milieu in which she grew up. But of course, she also says, and what she describes sounds very much like a nervous breakdown that looks like hysteria, which was actually the prevalent emotional, psychological, mental, whatever you want to call it, illness for women at the end of the 19th century. Freud made his career trying to find a cure for hysteria. And she says that some doctors said that the illness she had was only seen in older women. But of course, she said, no, it was the devil. And it's interesting, most authors, with very rare exceptions, as I say, some of these French men that I mentioned and Dorothy Day, very clearly talk about psychological distress. But authors to this day try to invent reasons why she could have had another physical illness, because of course it's impossible that a saint would have anything that sounds like psychological trouble. I beg to differ. I mean, I think that assuming that people who have emotional problems would not have a spiritual life, it's absurd. I mean, in reality, whatever our neuroses or psychological problems, they are also a way to God. So to say that everything that happened to Thérèse was because of the devil or because of some mysterious physical illness, encephalitis, whatever. I mean, there's a list of the things they say. No, she couldn't have had emotional distress. They're missing the point, and I think they're depriving people who are actually suffering emotionally from knowing that there's a saint, at least one, probably more, but in any case, who went through that, who suffered a lot, and yet became the greatest saint or one of the greatest saints. So one thing does not contradict the other. She herself describes herself during those 10 years of her life between her mother's death and when she was 14. Pleurnichant is the word she uses, weepy, as we would say in Spanish, llorona, crying all the time. And she says, I cried because of whatever happened, and then I cried because I had pride. All I needed to do was cry. Obviously, this is a child who's suffering. And that's a reality. If you think that she had first separated from her mother, then separated from Rose, then again her mother's died, then Pauline goes away, then Marie goes away, it's almost impossible to tolerate for a little child up to 9, 10 years old to go through all that. This is traumatic, and she's reacting to trauma like any child, normal child, would react to trauma by having some strong reaction. She got killed, interestingly, from that illness because supposedly a statue of the Virgin that was in her room smiled at her. So she's been losing all these mothers. She's been losing all these mothers, and now the Virgin smiles to her, and the Virgin is never going to go away. So that sense of, a mother who's going to be stable, smiling at her, brings her back from the sense of despair in which she was. There's much more, but the next important event in her life is on the Christmas when she was 14 or about to be 14. There was some incident in which her father got very impatient with her at that age, still being all excited because, you know, she was getting Christmas presents in her socks. Like believing in, not wasn't Santa Claus, but it's like believing in Santa Claus when you're 14. So the father sort of thought, come on, you're too old for that. And he made a comment like that she overheard. And she said, Jesus healed me at that moment. And this was a moment of conversion. Yeah, of course, Jesus healed her, but also it was like her father sort of shook her. Enough of being a child. Time that you start behaving like a person. And it was transformative for her. She says it started the third period of her life. One of the things she did immediately was starting to pray for sinners. And the first sinner she prayed for famously was a man who had killed 2 adult women and a girl and was about to be put to death and didn't want to repent. And she prayed for him. And apparently, right before he was about to be executed, he kissed a crucifix. So she felt that praying for him, for Pranzini, is what had saved Pranzini. So she decided she was going to save sinners by praying. So she wanted to get into Carmel at 15, which was unheard of. Pauline had gone in when she was 21. Normally, no one would be admitted in a convent before she was 18 or 19. So she went to the bishop, put her hair up to look like an older person to go talk to the bishop. And the bishop said, no, you're too young. A number of other people also had that reaction. There was a pilgrimage to Italy for the Jubilee of Pope Leo XIII. And her father took Celine and her to the Jubilee. So she decided to talk to the Pope, to ask the Pope for permission to become a Carmelite at 15. And they were told, not talking to the Pope, just kissing his ring, kneeling down, kissing his ring, and getting up. She ignored that and told him, please give me permission. If you give me permission, everybody will accept. And he couldn't understand because she was speaking in French and he was Italian. And maybe if he spoke a little French, he just couldn't get what this girl was saying. So he turned to the bishop, the vicar of the bishop standing next to him and said, I don't understand. What is she saying? Well, this is a girl who wants to be a Carmelite at 15. But the superiors say no. And Leo XIII said to her, well, if your superiors, agree, you will enter. If God wants you to enter, you will enter. And she said, but if you say it, everybody will obey you. So she keeps insisting, to the point that 2 Swiss guards have to get her up and take her out of the room physically. So it's interesting because this little girl who seems to be incapable of doing anything wrong suddenly challenges the highest people, including the Pope in a way. Another thing she talks about during this trip is that women in Italy are always excommunicated, and she doesn't understand why. I don't know if it's women in Italy, but one of the things she says is, why do people have so much problem with women? They were the ones who stayed at the cross while all the men ran away. So it's a little thing she says there. Aside from that, she finally enters the convent. And when she enters the convent, she's an unassuming, smiling, kind little nun that apparently is doing nothing but going about what everybody else does. The convent is very cold. Tuberculosis is rampant, and particularly it's very easy to get transmitted among women who are in such close quarters with each other, and in fact, several other women around the time, including her own cousin, before and after her, died of tuberculosis. She had a cough for some time, a year or two. On Holy Week 1896, she has an hemoptysis, vomits blood, and dies in September 1897. So here's some pictures of Thérèse that I've been talking about. This is her when her mother died. This is her, and the hand here on her shoulder is Celine. This is a photograph of both of them. She's probably around 9 years old here. This is when she's 14. She had very long blonde curls. And in fact, in the convent in Lisieux, they have a little, I thought of putting that photograph on, it was a bit too much. So they have the hair they took from her, which was this big, long blonde curls. Okay, let me just, why is this not moving? Okay. Sorry about that. Let me go back a minute. Okay, this is a picture of her when she went to see the bishop with her hair up. This is her as a novice when she first entered Carmel. This is during her years in Carmel. And this is a group photograph where we have her only there, but it's when she was around. And this is 3 months before her death. You can see the big circles under her eyes. And just from one photograph to the other, the size of the cheeks has, of course, diminished. This is a photograph of the sisters in Carmel with Mother Marie de Gonzague. So this is Thérèse, Marie, Pauline, Celine, and Mother Gonzague. It was unheard of that 4 sisters will be in the same convent. And also their cousin came in later. But they got the permits they needed, and she actually sort of cajoled Celine into coming into the convent. Celine wasn't sure if she wanted to get married, and Thérèse pestered her with letters until Celine came into the convent. So that's another advent. Okay, one of the things that it's important about Thérèse's life is that she had a very serious trial of faith when she was dying. Part of what she writes on Manuscript C is that she has stopped believing in heaven. And at the same time, she desperately wants to believe. Just think about it. This is a 24-year-old who's about to die, who went into the convent at 15 because she believed in God and believed in heaven. And now that she's dying, she's not sure that that was true. So she talks about sitting at the table of the unbelievers and there asking God for forgiveness with all of them, asking God for faith with all of them, because she is now one of the unbelievers sitting at that table. And remember, I had said before that people who were unbelievers, who were secularists, are anti-clerical and etc. She's resisting that with all her might, knowing that she also had all these doubts that people have. Okay, I'm talking here about the Leo Taxil hoax, and I want to talk about that a little bit more before we go to a break. There was a sort of a public thing in France around when Thérèse was dying about a woman called Diana Vaughan, who had been part of Masons and Satan cults and whatever, who was converting to Catholicism. And she was asking for people to pray for her so she would be free of that. And all this was a big to-do around France, particularly around French Catholics. And Thérèse had written a play about Joan of Arc and acted in the play with a wig, adding fleur de lis to her, the symbol of the French monarchy, to her habit. And this is like, paper, gold paper, silver paper, whatever. So she played this, composed the play, and acted on it for the nuns. So Mother Agnes, Pauline, who was then the Mother Superior, takes this photograph of Thérèse playing Joan of Arc and sends it to Diana Vaughan, we Carmelites are playing for you, and Joan of Arc, and etc. And then on a given day, no one had seen Diana Vaughan. On a given day, when everybody's going to see Diana Vaughan, this journalist, whose name was Leo Taxel, declares that Diana Vaughan never existed. Diana Vaughan never existed. He just invented her to show how ridiculous Catholics are, that believe in all these silly things and all that. And proof of that is that even nuns have been sending him these pictures, supposedly for Diana Vaughan. And this is some nun who is sending him that photograph, thinking that they're sending it to this Diana Vaughan, and ha 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 ha, he has, ridiculed them. Again, think she's dying. She thought she was praying for someone who's real. And she has been taken for a ride, and her image, that it's not seen in public normally because she's inside the convent, it's been put out there by this guy as part of ridiculing Catholics. This was, of course, another pain at that moment in her life. So eventually she dies. And this is her deathbed picture. And of course, she looks very calm, although she was in horrible, horrible pain for the last 2 or 3 months of her life. And in fact, could not take even communion for more than a month before she died, because she could not swallow practically anything. Certainly could not swallow anything solid, even as small as a host. No morphine, no painkillers, no nothing. There was a point when she was only breathing with the bottom part of one of her lungs. So even talking was impossible. So, but at death, you look at her and she looks so peaceful. And this is actually my picture of the place in the Lisieux Carmel. This is a statue. Her body was really very destroyed, but some of her bones are there. And on this wall here, on the outside of this wall in the garden, all her sisters are buried there now. But initially, when she died, she was just buried in the cemetery in the town, and not many people came because nobody knew who she was. And this is a statue of the Virgin of the Smile, the one who had smiled to her when she was a little girl. And by the way, the last of her sisters to die was Celine, who died when she was over 90 years old. And she died in 1959. So we were all alive when this last sisters died. Well, I mean, all, maybe not, but many of us in any case. Okay. So this is what we have about her life. And I'm going to talk more about her doctrine, her what she wanted to be, etc., for our second part. So let's take a little break now for maybe 5-7 minutes. I now have 3 minutes to 11. So let's come back about 3 minutes after 11. And Linda is going to play for us while you are on break. Thank you, Linda.
Welcome.
Okay, let's go now with Thérèse, Thérèse's desires and Thérèse's when she starts talking or when she talks about spiritual parts. So we've done her life, the circumstances, the historical circumstances, the details of her life, etc. We're now going to go into her thinking and her expressions of, her spirituality. So first of all, since she was a child, she wanted to be a great saint. And she says it, I wanted to be a great saint. And I knew that I would not have been able to become a great saint. I'm too little, again, the word little. I'm too incapable. I don't know how to do that. So the only thing I can do is hope for God to bring me up. And she uses the metaphor of the elevator. It was the beginning, end of 19th century, there were lots of inventions, and one of them was the elevator. So she says, okay, now there are these things called elevators that bring people up so they don't have to climb stairs. And since I am too little and I don't know how to climb these stairs, I don't have the energy to do that, I need the arms of Jesus to be my elevator. I need the arms of Jesus to bring me up. And she uses some words from scripture to talk about how this is possible. One of them is Proverbs 9:4. Whoever is a little one, let him come to me. And another one is from Isaiah 66. As one whom a mother caresses, so will I comfort you. You shall be carried at the breasts, and upon the knees they shall caress you. So what is interesting is she's not citing when the gospel, when Jesus says, let the little children come to me. She's talking about these Old Testament citations, and she did not have access to a Bible. The nuns did not have Bibles. So her only access to scriptures is whatever the preaching, the reading was, whatever was in the office, in Psalms or in the daily office that nuns and priests pray, the liturgy of the hours. And so whatever was there, and of course, it was in Latin, it wasn't in French. So what she gets is people preaching, so it's some of it is verbal knowledge, and some of it is, again, whatever she can understand from the liturgy of the hours in Latin. But also when Celine came into the convent, she came with two things. One was the camera. The pictures of Thérèse and the nuns we have in the convent are taken with a camera that Celine, again, inventions of the end of 19th century, that Celine brought into the convent. And Celine also brought into the convent a notebook in which she had written a number of passages from scripture. And that is the text that Thérèse has, not an actual Bible. But it's interesting because she does say, I wish I could, if I were a priest, and we'll get to that in a moment, I would not have just been content with Latin. I would have wanted to learn Hebrew and Greek to really look at the words of the scripture in their original. So it's interesting. Again, this is a very traditional woman who talks about a little this and little that all the time. And yet she says some of these things. And some of the other things that are very known about her is that in her letter to her sister Marie, what is manuscript B, she says, and some of these words are underlined 3 or 4 times, so they are rendered in capital letters in the manuscript. I feel within me the vocation of the warrior, the priest, the apostle, the doctor, the martyr. I feel within my soul the courage of the crusader, the papal guard. I would want to die in the field of battle in defense of the church. So warrior, priest, apostle, doctor, martyr, crusader, papal guard. I want to play all these manuscript masculine roles that are forbidden to me. And it's interesting because at no point she says, but I cannot because I'm a woman. In fact, this becomes even more interesting when she talks about priesthood. After she has said in this previous paragraph, the warrior, the priest, the apostle, the doctor, the martyr, the papal guard, the crusader, etc., she goes into a second paragraph that says, I feel in me the vocation of the priest. Again, priest underlined several times. With what love, O Jesus, I would carry you in my hands, when at my voice you would come down from heaven. But alas, while desiring to be a priest, listen to this, I admire and envy the humility of St. Francis of Assisi, and I feel the vocation of imitating him in refusing the sublime dignity of the priesthood. St. Francis of Assisi could say, I don't want to be a priest. She doesn't have the freedom to say, I'm going to be humble and not be a priest, because she's not going to be a priest. So, but she never says that. And at some point she actually says, why do I have to be, this is to Celine, why do I have to be a nun? I want to be an angel and better even a priest. Now, a number of people have written that, oh, no, she really did not mean that. She's talking about the priesthood of the people. In fact, when she was made a doctor of the church, some of the readings were readings from manuscript B, because it's one of her most important manuscripts. I'll talk about that in a second also. Of the 3 manuscripts, it's the one that it's more what she really feels and thinks and really wants. And they read big chunks of that manuscript and they skip over this paragraph when she's clearly talking about, I would carry you in my hands, when at my voice you would come down from heaven. Whatever we think about what the priests really do at that moment, that's not the issue now. It's what she believed, and it's what she wished she could do. There's another place in which she talks to Celine about some legend, tradition, whatever, that Saint Barbara had come to bring communion to Saint Stanislaus of Kostka. And she says very specifically, it was a woman, it was a virgin, she says, who brought communion, not an angel, not a priest. Saint Barbara is who God sends to give communion. And then she goes to say, when we are in heaven, we are all going to see things differently. And one of them is that people who wanted to be priests would be priests. So she's very clear about this very concrete desire. And a lot of this comes from this book, one of the books I mentioned from Claude Langlois, the French writer. And this is a book about the desire of priesthood of Thérèse of Lisieux. And it's really very interesting to see her wording there. Now, one of the things in this book that was more impressive, some of these comments I said that Celine said this or that or the other are from Celine's deposition for the canonization process. So she's speaking under oath about things that Thérèse told her. So probably the one that impressed me the most is this one. In 1897, Sister Thérèse told me, this is Celine speaking, that she expected to die that year. Here is the reason she gave for this in June, so 3 months before her death. When she realized she had pulmonary tuberculosis, she said, "You see, God is going to take me at an age when I would not have had the time to become a priest. If I could have been a priest, I would have been ordained at these June ordinations. So what did God do? So that I would not be disappointed, he let me be sick. In that way, I could not have been there, and I would die before I could have exercised my ministry." So let that sink in. This is a person who is glad she's dying because she would not have been able to be ordained a priest at 24, which would have been the normal time for her being ordained a priest, because she's sick, she's gonna die. So this death is a gift from God because she cannot be a priest. This is not a desire from someone who's thinking about the priesthood of the people, because we all share in the priesthood of the people, and I'm sure that we don't want to die at 24. I mean, we haven't, but that's besides the point. We don't believe in that so strongly that we really want to die, so we don't have to suffer the disappointment of not being able to be priests. Okay. And again, it's significant that some of these things in manuscript B were jumped at the liturgy of her doctor. Okay. So one of the important things she says after writing lots of things in manuscript B about all the things she wants to do, etc., what I read before, is that suddenly she realized that love comprised all vocations. I don't know if suddenly is the right word, but she has realized that love comprised all vocations. Love was everything. Oh, Jesus, my love. I want to be loved in the heart of the church. I want to be loved in the heart of the church. And it's an interesting thing that these 3 manuscripts that were written at 3 different times in her life, all the 3 manuscripts end with the word love. Okay. This little thing is, what's happening? Okay. Here is a $1 bill that was created about the ordination of women. One side is of this dollar is every type of discrimination based on sex is to be overcome and eradicated. Saint Thérèse of the Child Jesus is the patroness of equality for women in ministry. She felt called to be a priest in a church that would not test her call. She prayed for death at 24, the age of ordination, so she could celebrate in heaven at the age men could celebrate the Eucharist on earth. This dollar is offered in the hope that the equality of women and men will become common in the church. And then it cites Galatians. And in the back, it says, to encourage the church to celebrate the gifts and calls of women's equality with those of men, I am withholding the amount of dollars from this collection. I have contributed it to the Women's Ordination Conference. And this was a dollar bill that was put from it. This is copied from a real, I have several of these bills, and this is copied from one of those. My thing is not obeying. Okay. So I had said before that her emphasis is on a little way, on everyday little things. And that is really what she emphasizes in her teaching. Doing little things and making those little things be all of them acts of love. And they're very concrete things she did. For example, there was a nun she intensely disliked. And she smiled at this nun so kindly all the time that when the depositions came for the canonization, this nun said, I was her favorite because she was always smiling at me. So she clearly really did this. And there's a way in which it seems also almost ridiculous, letting yourself be sprinkled with dirty water from laundry is a small sacrifice. It's these small little things of every day, which in a way, it's making sainthood possible for everyone. If we do every little thing we do with love, we are doing what will bring us to be saints. And there have been people who made some comments. Yeah, well, the danger of this is telling women that if they just do their silly little things every day or the big little things every day, they don't need to care for other things that they may have a right to do. Okay, there's that danger. But forget that one for a moment. All of us, men or women, can do little things every day to show love to others, or any little thing we have to do with love. And we are moving on that elevator she was talking about into sainthood. And that, I don't know about you, but that's very consoling. I don't need to do extraordinary things. You know, I love Teresa of Avila, but founding 17 convents and having visions is not something that I'm capable of. So with Thérèse, all you need to do is do what you're supposed to do and do it with love, and you're becoming a saint. In fact, you're becoming a great saint by doing that. Okay, so something was left out of here. No. I don't know what this is. Okay. Okay, I think I'm skipping a slide. So let me just tell you. One of the things that is important for her is what was called her act of oblation. her offering herself. I think I deleted a slide there, I'm sorry. So being love in the heart of the church, the act of oblation, it's offering herself as a victim of love and mercy. And, you know, this business of being a victim, again, takes us to her context, takes us to the idea of victimhood and offering yourself to God as a victim, and etc. But let's not forget that this was a very Jansenist religion. It was a religion in which everything is about love and, sin and justice, and God is angry and he has to be placated. And in fact, the Sacred Heart, the huge Sacré-Cœur church in Paris, was created to the justice of God, to ask for forgiveness for all the bad things the French had done during the revolution. And in fact, when French was defeated with the Prussians in 1870-71, all the Catholics were saying it's punishment from God for all the secularism of the French Revolution. So there's this thing about justice and punishment and etc. And in fact, there are a number of nuns in Therese's convent who are offering themselves as victims of God's justice. So just takes revenge on them for all the things that the sinners are doing. I mean, it's a spirituality that really doesn't speak to us. But she sort of turns that around and says, well, what God wants is to be loved, and there's not enough love in the world. So I want to offer myself as a victim of love. Why do you have to be a victim? It's another story. It's the way in which she talked. But the important point is to pay attention and put your strength and your effort on the love of God, rather than put your attention on the justice of God. And so that is an important part of her. And as I've said in passing several times, Thérèse is the third woman doctor of the church. The first was Teresa, the second was Catherine of Siena. They were both made by Paul VI in 1970. And in 1997, on the centennial of Therese's death, John Paul II made her the third woman doctor of the church. There, among the hundreds and thousands of saints, there are only 36 who are doctors, and only 4 who are women. The fourth one is Hildegard of Bingen. Although she's in time earlier than all the others, she was made a doctor later than all the others by Benedict XVI. Doctors of the church are those saints, and they have to be saints. In fact, for Hildegard to become a doctor of the church, Benedict has to canonize her in May and make her a doctor in October of 2012. So first they have to be saints, and then they have to have some body of doctrine that can then be considered part of the doctrine of the church. It can be used to expand and clarify the message of the gospel, the Christian message. And when Thérèse was made a doctor, there was some discussion, like she doesn't really have a corpus of doctrine. She did not write books and that kind of thing, except for these notebooks that were made into a book. But one of the important things for doctors is that they would have a significant influence on the faithful. a significant influence on preaching in their own particular way the message of the gospel, sort of bringing the explanations home in one way or another. And obviously, Thérèse has had an enormous influence on the church. My mother never prayed, except when she prayed to Thérèse. So that it's an interesting, there are many people for whom that is the case. During World War I, there was a lot of people who had visions of Thérèse and of Joan of Arc fighting along the French soldiers, etc. I mean, it's a very, I already told you, she has more candles and statues than any other saint besides Francis, who, by the way, is not a doctor of the church. Okay. So she's the youngest of all doctors, of all 36 of them, and the one who is closest to us in time. And just as a little aside, I've been to Lisieux 4 times, and one of the times I was there, I was about to teach a course on women saints at San Diego State. And I got an audience there. It was so easy to get these audiences, I couldn't believe it, with who was then the Mother Superior, Mother Lucille. And I said, I'm going to be teaching in women's studies about saints. I'm going to be teaching about Thérèse. What should I say to my students? And her response was that they should be whoever they wanted to be, because Thérèse wanted to be many things that she was not allowed to be. Okay, then I go see the auxiliary bishop, Guy Gaucher, who has actually written a lot of things about Thérèse. She's dead now. And one of the things he said, and he was pounding on the table, people tell me that Thérèse cannot be a doctor because she only had a 5th grade education. How could I compare her with Thomas Aquinas? Well, number one, you cannot exclude women from the club and then blame them for not being members of the club. Second, men in the church have to do something about the situation of women. You know, Catherine of Siena had Raymond of Capua. Teresa of Avila had Domingo Bañez. Joan of Arc had no one, and look what happened to her. It is our duty to make a difference. And yes, she had only a 5th grade education. And if with a 5th grade education, she was capable of saying what she said, of course she's as good as Thomas Aquinas with all his university education. And bang, bang, bang on the table. I went with a friend who didn't speak French. And when we left, she said, what was all that banging on the table that he was doing? Anyway, so there's been a lot of discussion also that this whole thing about having women doctors of the church is a way of appeasing women, but not changing the church, particularly no mentioning women priesthood and etc. And so there has been some reaction like, yeah, okay, it's great to have them, but it doesn't really change the situation for much women. It's changing slowly. We know that. It's changing, little by little. And, it making Thérèse a doctor of the church, even if they excluded certain parts of her writing from the specific ceremony of creating the doctorate, does not change the fact that she wrote this, and that it means that her writing is part of the doctrine of the church. So what are you going to do with that? So it could become something that dilutes, but it also could become something that empowers women, because this very simple, uneducated young woman said things that the whole church may need to hear. Okay, so I'm going to go to questions and comments in a second, but let me, just in case any of you want, this is my email address if you want to contact me. And this is my webpage. And this is the cover of a book I wrote where there's a very long chapter on Thérèse and also a lot of talk about her, writing about her in the section where I'm talking about women doctors of the church and what they mean and etc. And then also, you know, here it's unabashedly, I'm going to be doing a context conversation for this company that is doing seminars about women, sainthood in the Americas, and identity. The first canonized saints, both in South and North America, have been women. And that's something that it's interesting to look at, and interesting to look at the impact they did to their respective countries. I'm going to be doing that, and it's next Sunday, I believe, right? Yeah, next Sunday, in the like at 2, 3, 1 noon, something like that. I don't remember the time right now. So there it is. It's a little complicated because, you know, links are a little complicated, but if you want to know more and you want to write to me, I'll send you the link directly, or perhaps we can keep it there for a little while so you can look at it. Let me also go to the readings quickly. I'm going to, this is going to be available to you. So let me say briefly what is here. Dorothy Day biography of Thérèse, and this book, Thérèse et Lisieux, is basically photographs. The text is in French, but it's mostly photographs. Carol Flinders, from many, many years ago, wrote this book on women mystics. And there's one on Teresa of Avila and one on Thérèse. They're both very good. This is my book, again, on the list. Mary Frolick is a specialist on Thérèse of Lisieux, and she has a short book on her essential writings with introductions to all the writings. Monica Furlong wrote a biography. It has some errors, but it's a very lively. And then there's Guy Gaucher that has several books on Thérèse. The original is in French, but there's a translation of that book in English from Crossroads. Gaucher also has the story of Thérèse of Lisieux, and again, it's translated into English. Kathleen Harrison has a Saint Thérèse of Lisieux. She has one on Arc, one on Thérèse of Lisieux. And then there's Claude Langlois, who I just mentioned, which has not been translated, but his last book on Thérèse is about Thérèse and mercy after Pope Francis started writing about or talked about mercy. So these are the three main books about Thérèse's life. This one from Maître is a socio-historical psychoanalysis. As I said, it talks about her mental illness. Nevin, that I mentioned a minute before, it's probably my favorite book in English about Thérèse. I would highly recommend that. Stephen Payne wrote a very interesting book when Thérèse was declared doctor of the church. And he's a Carmelite. It's very nice book about things that go beyond Thérèse's life. Then there's the story of a soul that it's now being published regularly by the Institute of Carmelite Studies in Washington. The third edition is from 1996, translated and with notes by Clark. A recent printing of that, which is not a new version in any way, but it's a recent printing, is from 2017. There's Jean-François Six that wrote about the childhood of Thérèse of Lisieux, Neurosis and Sanctity. And that one is not translated into English as far as I know. But Light in the Night is translated into English. I don't know who did the translation, but it is. And then John Sullivan in Carmelite Studies number 5 wrote about Thérèse right after the doctorate. Okay, so let's go back to here if you want to copy the any of these links or things, and it is time for questions. And Corey, I don't know if you want to read the questions or if you want me to read the questions. I don't know if I have the chat right here. Let me see. Yes, I have the chat. Okay. Bibliography is not visible, showing the authors. Well, you'll get a copy of the bibliography. Is your book on Amazon? Yes. All my books are on Amazon, about, I don't know, several of them. Okay. What else? It says that there are 26, but I see only the ones that are here. So maybe I'm missing some. Oh, there's more here. I cannot hear well. Okay.
So I think one question, Oliva, that we had was, I believe it's, which of the biographies has a chapter on mental illness?
Well, Nevin talks about it. Dorothy Day has a chapter entitled Mental Illness. I don't think Nevin has a chapter entitled Mental Illness, but talks about it as mental illness.
I think that was really the only question in terms of content. But if folks have other questions, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and ask those questions, or to type them in the chat if that's easier, and I will pass them along.
Yeah.
This is Carrie, and I'm just scrolling through the chat, and somebody did ask, how was Thérèse finally admitted to the convent at such a young age? The Pope did not intervene, so what changed superiors' minds?
Okay. One of the things that changed it is that the vicar of the bishop was in that pilgrimage. And although he was very annoyed with, the fact that she was talking without permission, he saw her behavior all through the pilgrimage. And it made him realize that she wasn't joking, so to speak, that this was not just a girl who had an idea, but someone who was very serious about this. So he talked to the bishop, and eventually they all changed her mind. And she could not enter when she wanted. By Christmas of when she was 15, she entered after Easter, because the nuns were afraid that they do a very serious fast during Lent, and maybe it wasn't a good idea for her to do that. And I'm sorry, my voice sort of went away when I looked on the side. I should have put on my earplugs with the mic, but I didn't, so sorry about that. I'll try to stay looking at you now. There was a message saying Andrew was raising his hand. So Andrew, what would you like to say?
Yeah, so one saint, I guess this unofficial Brazilian saint that really kind of floored me, Escrava Anastasia. And there's all this, I guess she's widely celebrated throughout South America and Latin America. And her story, wow, floored me. But she's not a Catholic. She's never recognized by the Catholic Church. Do you have a position on Escrava Anastasia?
I don't even know who she is. First time I hear her mentioned. But there are some figures that become, that people become interested in, who are never saints, just sort of characters of some form of popular cult. But I have never heard of this person. So I have no idea who she is. Okay.
And then Donna was asking, why didn't they have Bibles in the convent?
Because Catholics did not read the Bible before Vatican II. It was bad to read the Bible because it has a number of things that you are not going to understand, so don't read it. I mean, it was, my father happened to have a Bible, so I did have a Bible at home, but we were not encouraged to read it. It was read your missal. In your missal, you have everything you need to know. No need to have a Bible. So actually, it was Pius XII who started encouraging reading of the Bible sort of at the end of his pontificate, but it became more explicit after Vatican II.
So here's another question. I've heard the argument that Joan of Arc, Saint Joan of Arc, and Saint Wilgefortis demonstrate like an implicit endorsement of transgender, transsexual people as holy. Do you have a position on that?
It's certainly possible to look at them and say, look, not all saints look perfectly feminine and sweet, or whatever, or perfectly masculine and whatever we think about masculine. So yes, I mean, was Joan of Arc transgender, or was she just dressing that way because otherwise she would have been raped a lot easily, being among soldiers? It's hard to tell. Wilgefortis is the thing about growing the beard overnight and to avoid marriage. But for Joan of Arc, it's hard to tell what, and it's difficult to, some of what happens is that we try to put these ideas we have now on people who were then. And were they or were they not the way we understand things we understand now? Possibly. For sure? No, there's no for sure about anything of people who are back there and then. And Wilgefortis, whatever, I don't know how to pronounce her name, it's probably a legend. But even so, it's interesting. She's also represented as crucified. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Well, the story I heard was that supposedly, the aggravated heresy was a capital offense. So alleging that God told her to lead the French into victory, that was simple heresy. And then dressing as a man was aggravated heresy. That warranted capital punishment. And so when the Catholic Church posthumously overturned her death penalty, her conviction, there are those who argue that the posthumous overturning is an implicit endorsement of transgender people as being holy.
That's possible. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying I'm not completely clear, and I don't think anybody is completely clear about that. She was put to death because she was dressing like a man. But dressing like a man is not the same as being transgender. Theoretically, I'm dressing like a man right now. I'm wearing pants. Okay. And in fact, one of the things that happened after she was reversed and started being, she was not canonized until 1920. So it took 5 centuries to canonize her. One of the things that started happening was that she was being represented wearing skirts and with long hair, which she did not have. She did not have long hair and she did not wear skirts. But it was part of, how are we going to accept someone who's violating what we think cannot be violated and deserves being put to death? So it's, okay. There are a number of studies of people who know more than me about that. I know Edith Venkov, professor of history at San Diego State, has a number of things written about executions of transgender and other people. So she's probably more of an authority than I am. Diane, you had your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to share some of my reflections and then ask a question. I was very struck with her teaching love comprising all vocations.
Mm-hmm.
And what she says about the little way is so similar. Maybe Thomas Keating gets this right from her, to do ordinary things with extraordinary love, but he taught that so much. And I appreciated your presentation. Thinking of the many cultural obstacles, there is an ecclesial false self. It's not just individual. The culture is a huge obstacle to the gospel and the contemplative way. And I so appreciated her persistence. I thought of that phrase today of "yet she persisted." So thank you for that.
Yeah. Sorry,
ahead.
interrupted. No. Go ahead.
I also was thinking so much about, we learn as contemplatives about mixed motivation. We all have mixed motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking of her and her sisters entering the convent, her parents had wanted to be there, it's all okay. We all have mixed motivation, but the key thing is that we sit in the silence, and there is a singular path of love, and God can do everything with that consent. So can you comment at all upon anything more contemplatively about her practices?
Well, I mean, you could say that doing everything you do with love is a form of contemplation. Contemplation is a long look, loving look at the real, at whatever is around us. So that's there. Now, she influenced many people. She influenced Georges Vernanot, who was a very famous French writer. She influenced many others. And any Catholic person would have read her story. So probably Father Keating read her story. Otherwise, he would not have been a monk. I mean, she was so prevalent that it's impossible to not have read her. So that is probably some of what was behind that. And again, just thinking that you are right there, being the presence of Jesus for all these nuns. She talks about how unpleasant it is to live with 25 women, some of whom are very coarse, very difficult, very grouchy, very whatever. But everybody who knew her said she always had a gentle smile and always went around smiling at people and doing everything she needed to do without raising a fuss. And that's what makes her so special. So it's very much there. And yes, the mixed motives are very much there. She said she had gone to Carmel, not because Pauline was there, but because she wanted to go for Jesus. Yeah, of course. She wanted to go for Jesus. I don't doubt that. But the fact that Pauline was there with Jesus probably would help, And whatever, that's what I said before, whatever your emotional fragilities, you're really there also developing your spirituality, regardless of what other things may be happening to you and other ways in which you may be suffering or being disconcerted or whatever. I have a sign saying that 3 participants raised hand, but it doesn't give me the name of the 3 participants. So if you are one of those participants, raise your hand. I mean, tell me.
It's Susie and then Christina. And then there was also a question in the chat as well.
Okay. So let's do Susie, Christina, and then you can read me the question in the chat. Susie.
Well, I have to say I have more of a comment or thank you for using this term that helped me understand her better, dulcified. Because, I tuned in today because to be perfectly honest, I've often had an aversion to Thérèse of Lisieux
Absolutely.
because of the way she's been presented to me, often by very pious Catholics in a very sugary kind of way that I just could not kind of see a more, I would say, you know, kind of a dimensional person. So thank you for that terminology, and also for just deconstructing some of that French. You know, it sounded like that term about petite, is it like pobrecito in you know, that this kind of wording that we may not get, but it's hard in English to understand 100 years later. So thank you so much for that. And it makes me want to learn more about her, especially your insight that, okay, they canonized her without talking about all the revolutionary things she said, but it's still there. You can't take it away. So thank you for that. So I appreciate it.
That's why I started by saying that we have to bypass her language, because if I get stuck in the way she talked, I can't tolerate her. She's unbearable. She's a typical little stupid woman, rather than the strong saint she really was, because she's hiding behind all that wording. And some of that wording also was cultivated by her sisters. There's a couple of times when her sisters are trying to still treat her like the little girl, like the little sister in the family who was crying all the time and weeping when she was a little girl. And she has to gently push them away and say, I'm not that anymore. She says, Jesus has instructed me. I am a different person than that little girl. And you knew. And so but still she talks like women of her time. Pauvre petit, my poor little father, my poor little whatever. And that's a French way of talking, particularly in the 19th century. My poor little this and my poor little that. I mean, not so long ago, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, I'm not sure. I went to a conference, I don't even remember why or how, with a friend of mine. And there was a woman there presenting on Thérèse, and she kept saying, oh, she had a happy childhood, and she had a happy childhood. And I could not stay in my seat, practically. It's like, don't say that, it's not true. She suffered a lot during her childhood, to the point that she had an emotional crisis that, you know, rendered her completely incapable to function for several months. So don't keep saying, oh, she had a happy childhood. What is a happy childhood of someone who loses one mother figure one after another? Can that be happy? But, you know, people have this dosified thing and aversion towards her. That's what I'm saying, that it's, you have to read her in a different way in order to sort of pass all that language. There are a couple other people with hands up, please.
So we'll do Christina, then the question in the chat, then Victoria.
Okay, Christina.
Hello. Hello. I know Father Thomas Keating has a book on Thérèse of Lisieux.
Ah,
okay. I went to look for it, but I couldn't find it in my books. But he wrote one beautiful book about her.
Okay, there you have it. So yes, of course he had read her. Okay. Chat question?
Yeah, so it was a question from Luz, and let me find it again. What prompted so many girls like Thérèse and her sisters of the time to enter the convent?
Okay, in the case of Thérèse and her sisters, the parents pretty much pushed them to go in the convent. Her middle sister, Leonie, was the only one who did not become a Carmelite, was very much of a problem child. And as a young adult, her problems were presented in getting into a convent and not tolerating it and having to leave the convent, and going into another convent, same thing. So she made an enormous effort until she finally found a convent that would take her. It was like the house they lived in when they were little girls was a convent. Remember, her mother said that her own life, mother's life, was like a shroud. And she lived in this very dark thing. You have to make sacrifices and you have to pray. And this life doesn't matter. It's only the next life. And a very sort of negative, sad way of looking at life. So that, aside from that, Langlois, this my favorite author in French about Thérèse, his first important book was about women congregations and women nuns in 19th century France. So it was right after the revolution. And when Napoleon and after Napoleon, congregations were allowed to come back. Not only some of them came back, such as Carmel, but other new ones were founded at that time. And particularly the orders, the congregations that were about social services were encouraged by the Republican government, even though they were anti-clerical, because no one had the energy to be taking care of the elderly and of the sick and all those kinds of things, except these women who were nuns. At the same time, like from centuries, in convents, women have possibilities that they did not have in married life. Because marriage was not what we look at marriage now. Marriage was one child after another with no kind of birth control, no control at all, with no antibiotics. So dying in childbirth was a common thing. That was so many, I've said this before, so many fairy tales, the girls have stepmothers because they did have lots of stepmothers. Women died very young. Men lived longer. Now we have the reverse. But at that time, it was women who died younger, usually dying in childbirth. So it was one child after another and no opportunity for doing anything that was for yourself. So from back there in the Middle Ages, going through Teresa of Avila and anyone you can think of, when Claude Langlois is looking at nuns in 19th century France, he says that aside from the fact that the country benefited from the work of these women, the ones who did not have an education, found the chance for an education or for something that gave meaning to their life and physically saved their lives from death in on childbirth. And the ones who had a sense of leadership, who were educated and wanted to do something, also found the possibility of doing that through the convent. And that was true in the US. The daughters of immigrants who did not have any education went into the convent and were able to get some education and do something productive. And the daughters of immigrants who were more intelligent, perhaps a little bit more educated, or wanted or had the capacity for a higher education, found a way of doing something with their lives by becoming nuns. So that it was convents, and there's authors from in different directions, even Jewish authors, who say very clearly that the Catholic Church is the only one that gives women a place where they can be considered good and working on their own lives and their own growth and whatever they want to do, rather than having to be mothers and having to be wives and living their life in that kind of context. So, okay, I think we may have time for one or two more questions because it's almost getting late. So let's do that.
Victoria raised her hand.
Victoria.
Yes, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I've enjoyed all your presentations for St. Mary Magdalene, and I really appreciate your contributions to our learning. I just wanted to say, as a historian myself, I'm principally a literary and art historian, and not a whatever straight out political historian. I just wanted to sort of make a comment about the dulcifying, etc. I completely understand what you mean. I think that's true in general with the saints. That's kind of a tradition of the church to sort of leave out all the less, just like with scripture, to leave out the less sort of controversial or problematic aspects of people's lives in general, or what they said. But having said that, I do feel like Thérèse of Lisieux happens to be one of the spiritual writers from the tradition I've read everything she wrote. I've read all her poems and her plays and the L'Histoire de l'âme and everything in the original. And I know exactly what you mean, that, but I think, I don't know, for me, my approach to history has always been to try as much as possible, even though it's not possible really to, enter completely into the time of a person. But I feel that, as you said yourself, from the context of her time and place, I think, she was, everything she wrote, I don't see it as being, I mean, you said that you found it almost unbearable to read her writing, and the sort of the mon pauvre and all that sort of thing. But I feel like it's so much a part of that time and place that reading it in the sense of that she was, is, to me, is very beautiful and doesn't in the slightest detract from the power of her messages and the power of her contribution. So I think I don't know. So I just wanted to kind of qualify the way I react to that. And also as a historian, I feel like it can get very cloudy but you pointed this out too with the transgender question, to impose our own interpretations from the 21st century onto figures from the past. I mean, in my own experience as an art historian, endless books that have been published about Michelangelo or Leonardo, that they were gay and this and that, and they were misunderstood. Although there's no actual documentary evidence. I mean, it doesn't matter either way, but I think things can get kind of murky if we're always looking through with our own lens and also our own agenda, as you said too. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, again, different people react differently to things. When I read Thérèse now, those, mushy little words don't interfere with, but I can see how they can interfere, because they were for me for a while, of saying, I mean, as a child, I read her and thought, oh, she's sweet. She's a little girl like me. But when I grew up, it's like, ugh. So, and that's why you have to go beyond the language and understand it, as you just said, Victoria, as the common language of the time, which it's something that has changed. For her, it would have changed if she would have lived in our time, because she's writing like people wrote at her time. So, any other questions before we say goodbye with a little bit more music? Okay, well, as I said, you will get access to a video and the bibliography. I'm gonna send the bibliography to Corey in a format that it's better than this red, this red background slide. So it's more readable. So I'm gonna send it as soon as we finish. And thank you very much to all of you for being here, for listening. And again, if I can say so, even though this is a free presentation, we do appreciate any donations. Mary Magdalene lives only off donations. We don't have any support from the official hierarchy. So we would appreciate if you do that. Okay, so thank you very much. And I hope to see you again at another presentation. God knows when we will do that, but you know, I look forward to seeing you again and maybe seeing you in my presentation on Saints in the Americas through Context Travel next week. Okay, thank you and goodbye. And Linda, take us on for, you know, about maybe 3-4 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Oliva. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Okay.